All right, guys, we're back talking about heritability of intelligence, just what you guys were waiting for. So we know from previous studies what heritability is. If you don't, need to go back and look it up. We know that it's the percentage within a population of how the genetic code relate or allows for the variation within a population, right? So think back to the plants that have all the same soil, all the same sunlight, all the same water. Some are slightly taller than others. That's because of 100% genetics. So when we're talking about something like intelligence, right, we need to think about uh, how this works, right? What is the heritability of intelligence? And remember, we do that with humans by looking at twin studies, right? Uh, Identical twins reared apart show us that genetics are the same, environments are different. Therefore, we can create a percentage within a population of a trait heritability, right? So let's look at these pie charts. So there's a couple different estimates in terms of the relationship of genetics to intelligence. We know that higher intelligence people, if they have kids, tend to have higher intelligence kids. But we also know that the environment is really critically important. And I think that there's, kind of both good news and bad news here. Um, so on the high end, right, the high estimates are that 80% of intelligence is based off of heredity, and only 20% of your final intelligence score comes from the environment. On the other hand, the flip side is that 40% of the intelligence is genetically based, and that 60% comes from your experience. Now, that's a pretty big difference, but at the end of the day, right, we know that heredity, that your genetic code accounts for a good chunk of your intelligence, right? Probably around at least half, right? It's probably at least half heredity, half environment. Um, so the good news is that the environment plays a major role, right? Your choices, the effects you make, or the choices you make, have a major effect on your intelligence throughout your lifetime, right? Especially early on, especially early childhood interventions. Um, Even things like prenatal vitamins that your parents would take, or that will have a major role in terms of your environment, your intelligence scores. The other hand, which is good, because why are we spending all this money in schools and social programs and stuff if everything was just based off of genetics, right? We would just not do any of that because there wouldn't be any point. Um, Now, I guess maybe the downside is that there is some genetic component that no matter what is done, right, genetics are going to be limiting to some people, right? That you're just going to run into an upper limit there. Um, and that's just the way that it is, right? That's the way it is with everything else. Um, so we know, right, that intelligence is heritable, right? It has some genetic component. And when we do those twin studies that I mentioned, right, we see that identical twins reared apart have a much higher correlation of IQ scores than even siblings reared together, or fraternal twins reared together, right? That you have a much higher correlation between identical twins reared apart than you have with these other groups. But also notice that the highest one is identical twins reared together, right? So the most similar environment you can get, and exactly the same genetics, gives you roughly a correlation of plus 85, which is, very, very, very high. So we know that there's this genetic influence on intelligence, right, that we can see by using the twin studies. In fact, there have been other studies done. This is not heritability, right? That while there's no single intelligence gene that's out there, there's been estimates that about 75% of the population variability in IQ is attributed to genes, right? That's again, that's the high end there. Um, this really has to do with what are called epigenetic processes, right? The effect that the environment changes our genetic code in some way. So again, you can see these identical twins that look slightly different, um, right? That's epigenetics in play there. And we know that those small initial differences can then continue to self-select reinforcing things that work for them, right? So that can lead to even further differences there. When we talk about other differences, especially involving intelligence, when we look at brains, right? If we're looking at uh, the individual differences between genetics versus environment, we know that the white matter, which is the axons in the brain, identical twins have more similar brains than fraternal twins do, right? So dizygotic versus monozygotic twins, that's what the DZ and the MZ stand for, that when you actually look at the thickness of the cortex, the cortices in the frontal and temporal lobes, and you look at the white matter, you see that identical twins, rather if they're reared together or not, have very similar brain structures, and that shows us that again that genetics help build the structure of our brains, which then can account for all of the individual differences that we have. Again, knowing that there's not one gene that you can turn on or off that allows for this. So we'll do a quick reminder that environmental influence comes from adoptive child. So we know that if there's an adoptive child, are they more or less likely to be similar to their biological parents or their adoptive parents in terms of IQ? Um, if this is a strong genetic component, we know that they're probably leaning towards the biological parents. However, uh, we actually see that adoptive kids are more like their adoptive parents in terms of IQ scores. This shows you the prevalence and the importance of early childhood education, right? Things like, early access to schooling, preschool, reading, being read to by parents at home, right? Even having books in the home are seen as major markers of future IQ future IQ, a high IQ in the future. That we see that again when we look at when they study children in orphanages or children in poverty. Usually, these environmental factors lead to a lower IQ score than would otherwise be predictive. So we know that the environment has a major effect on IQ scores, right? And again, we see this with adoptive parents and adoptive children. So we know that school's important. We know that there's a push for things like universal pre-K that's being pushed in this country now. Philadelphia actually just is implementing universal pre-K that's paid for by that soda tax that everybody hates. Right, the money for that is going, at least in theory, is going to pay for universal pre-K programs in the city. That intervention pays off because we know that early childhood interventions in particular have a much higher impact on IQ scores uh, than really anything else outside of a mother's health while she's pregnant. Increased schooling is related to those higher intelligence scores. This is something that is shown again and again and again in the data. So schools are really important. Good schools are really important, which is why they're so fundamental to almost every politician's policies, right? Because people know that good schools are one of the most important things that people have in their lives because it sets them up for a trajectory for success or failure. So let's get into some basic questions, right? Different cultures uh, emphasize different things, right? Looking at an intelligence test from one culture to another, right? Those traits might not carry over. If you're a Bedouin herder in the north or in the Saharan desert, you probably don't need to know calculus. That's probably not that much of a useful skill to you. But knowing which plants are safe to eat, where to take your herds for access to water, right? These other things become more important. So we need to make sure that we have a consistent definition of intelligence so that we're able to apply it to all of the cultures of the world, right? That the different individual mental skills, show this cultural diversity. But when we talk about intelligence as a whole, we really need to make sure that it encompasses everything. Uh, so we see cultural differences in IQ scores, right? Some people in the past have said that that's because different cultures are just smarter than others. Now we know that that's just, depends on who's making the test and what they're being tested on, right? It depends on that validity that we talked about earlier. And so it's similar to these these, plants, right? That the soil, the genes can be the same, right? But the soil really matters, right? That you can see this difference between the groups is really important because the soil matters, the environment matters. So what are we talking about when we mention differences in culture and individual differences? Well, one of the things we can look at are gender differences and similarities, specifically regarding with IQ. So there are 7 ways that are highlighted here that in which males and females differ on various abilities. So you see that there's a lot of the mental abilities that actually girls are better at than boys. Um, that actually probably shouldn't come as much of a surprise, although usually I get some pushback on some of this stuff. Um, One of the interesting things that I'm going to highlight here is that point 6 is that boys tend to outperform girls at math problem solving, right? So when they're trying to think of the creative problem solvings, but they underperform at actually doing the basic math. So if you've ever known how to solve a problem, but then you forgot to carry the 2 or something like that, right? That's an example of that happening there, which is also really interesting when you think about the fact that there's a stigma against women in math, that women are worse at math, or not designed, right, to go into scientific fields or math heavy fields. We know that that's actually not true, that there's absolutely no basis of fact in that. In fact, the computation skills are generally better than boys. Now, this tends to even out in adulthood. Some of, typically girls, as we'll see in the developmental unit, typically girls mature a little bit faster than boys. So there's a lag there. Girls tend to be more mature than boys are, especially in adolescent years. But once they reach adulthood, that usually does even out. Um, let's talk about social class and IQ. It's another type of difference that is highlighted, today culturally, right? Socioeconomic status is important. So if you look at the breakdown of people with a mild, what we would consider a mild intellectual disability, right, 60 to 69, in the IQ range, you see that the vast majority of those people are in unskilled or semi-skilled labor, right? This is a major push, right, away from, um, I guess, education, right, which kind of makes sense, right? If someone's struggling intellectually, they might not get school, might not be as easy, so they might not go into those professional, non-manual, right, the college professors or the accountants or whatever, right? They might be more suited, or might find the work of an unskilled, laborer or semi-skilled um, laborer being a little bit more fitting. But again, not unproductive members of society, contributing in many ways, and still able to learn and all those things. But when we look at those with severe uh, or IQs uh, that are lower than 50, we actually see a more evenly spread throughout social class. Now, notice those numbers are still really low, right? Number of cases per 100, right? We're still talking about really nothing more than 5%. And one of the explanations here is you can see that the non-professional, non-manual laborers, right? They could be, an example could be like a savant, like a music, someone like we talked about before, who's just this music virtuoso, that, they have a job at an orchestra, right? That's professional, non-manual, but they're severely limited in other ways. Um, so that can explain some of the what looks like a big jump there. That could be because of, the drastic nature of that disability that, leads to savant syndrome or something like that. Um, okay, I want to take a since we're talking about differences, and we talked a little bit about women in math and the stereotype that's there. We should talk a little bit about stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is uh, something that was coined in the 80s. I think it was the 80s or 90s, about when they were looking at. I was just listening to a podcast about this. And it's not the one that you have an assignment for. It was a new one, um, where they were looking at the math scores of women and people of color, um, at the University of Michigan, that they were looking at math majors and why was it that men seemed to be, in some instances, scoring higher. And they developed a laboratory setting to test this. And what they realized is that if people from a minority group that have a specific stereotype against them from being competent, whether that's a stereotype that African Americans aren't good at school or that women aren't good at math or science, that there's this cultural stereotype against them, that there's this kind of self fulfilling prophecy that leads to that stereotype coming true. So, to put it in other words, if you're a woman and you're aware of this stereotype about being bad at math and you're given a difficult math test, one of the reasons why you might not score as high is because you're worried about that stereotype coming through true, right? That you're taking some mental uh, some bandwidth, if you will, away from your actual computational skills, and you're worrying a little bit about, oh man, I hope I don't prove this stereotype true, and I'm gonna, fail this, and it's gonna show that women aren't as good as men, and that's gonna be bad. So there's this threat, right, that you're gonna conform to a stereotype that shows up with anyone who's in a marginalized community. Um, right? So we see it with math and women. We've seen it with African Americans in schooling. And actually, one of the things that's been proposed is to take the demographic questions that you usually have to answer at the beginning of a standardized test and put them at the end, right? Because if you're someone who comes from a background who's not supposed to do well at school, being reminded of that when you start before you take the test might trigger stereotype threat and might result in lower grades. In fact, from a clinical standpoint, from not a clinical, from a experimental standpoint, right? When they do these things in labs, they can actually remove the stereotype threat. And they've done it in very simple ways by moving the demographic stuff to the end of the test, or by even saying, hey, we know that there's a stereotype regarding, women not being good at math, but don't worry, this standardized test has removed that stereotype from it, that the results are gender, are non-biased based of gender. And that disclaimer at the beginning gets rid of stereotype threat, right? People score what they score, right? The averages between men and women go back to even, instead of men being a little bit higher on the tests. So we know that stereotype threat is real. Um, it's an important phenomenon to understand, right? And you can see how it fulfills the self-fulfilling prophecy, and then the stereotype just gets reinforced, right? And then it's more likely to show up again, and it's just this horrible cycle. Um, and the podcast that I'm assigning for you to listen and write a quick reflection paper on deals with someone who took that stereotype that was against them in a kind of a novel situation at a poker table, and to applying that stereotype, knowing that people had that stereotype against them, and applying that to actually be successful at the poker table. So they changed the phrasing there. For instead of a stereotype threat, they called it a stereotype tax, because they were taxing other people's stereotypes to then reap the rewards. So it's a really interesting podcast, especially if you're a fan of Texas Hold'em poker. You'll recognize some names and some people that are being mentioned. So I encourage you all to listen to that, and write a little reflection about what stuck with you, and what makes you, what are you still thinking about after listening. So the last thing I'm gonna mention here, which kind of ties everything together, the nature nurture debate, IQ, and individual differences, is something that's called the reaction range model, which is very straightforward, which says that nature gives us an inherited range, right? That whether that's height, or IQ, in this case IQ, you are born with a certain range that your IQ could be. That no matter what happens environmentally, your IQ will be within this range, right? Let's say 80 to 110. And no matter what you do, you'll never go below an 80 and you'll never go above a 110. What the environment then does is based off of your choices, based off of your parents' choices, access to early education, prenatal vitamins, your desire to read independently, those kinds of things can help place your actual IQ firmly down on one side or the other, right? That there's this range, and then your environment places you within that. So we can see that again in these different quality of environment kind of categories, right? There's those in an enriched environment tend to be at the higher end of their range because of that environment. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who's in an enriched environment is a genius, right? based off of genetics, right? That could essentially save someone from an intellectual disability diagnosis, right? From being below a 70 in terms of IQ. You have average, right? People who are in the middle, and then you also have the deprived side, right? Where people, look at Alice there in the bottom right hand corner, who still has a very high GPA, right? 125 is borderline genius, but it could have been even higher, right? Almost even a 145, right? 3 standard deviations above if she had only been in an enriched environment. So you can see how this ties kind of everything together. That's why I like to end with this. This is the last slide, by the way. That's why I like to end with this because it ties in the nature nurture debate in a nice, easy visual. It also highlights IQ, right, and how IQ can change or gets fixed due to the environment, and is also related to the heredity of the or heritability, I guess I should say, of intelligence because it shows us this range and the relationship between genetics and environment at play. So that's it. There's a lot here, guys. Please make sure that you let me know what questions you have. We will convene together before our test, so you'll have time to ask those questions in person. Yeah, so let me know what questions you have. If something's burning and you need to know an answer now, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time I see you.